elasticity that we dealt with the other time. We'll see how firms, governments, and even households use their idea of elasticity in their different ways in terms of their pricing mechanism for the firm, taxation policies for the government, and whether it will be advisable for the household who is in the production sector to either produce more or less of a good or service. So we'll be applying our idea of elasticity to firms, governments, and then say the farmer, for instance. So let's start with the firm. The number one idea or assumption of any firm is that they intend to make more profits. So how will the firm use their understanding of the elasticity of the product they are dealing with to manipulate the system to make more revenue? We are saying that if firms know exactly the elasticity of their good or their service, then they can decide whether to increase the price or to decrease price to boost their revenue. Let's have this case where the firm is dealing with a good which has elastic demand. And here, the firm has to decide whether to increase price or to decrease its price level to make more revenue. Let's assume the initial price is 200 and then the initial quantity is 12. Now the firm wants to make more revenue, so it decides to increase the price from 200 to 250. And this increase leads to a fall in quantity from 12 to 8. Now we know this because we know the responsiveness of the consumers. We know they have elastic demand, which means when you increase price by 1 unit, they'll reduce their quantity by more than 1 unit. So calculating this, the initial total revenue of the firm will be the 200 times the 12, which will give us 2,400, which means this will be their total revenue. So now the price has been increased from 200 to 250, so that the new total revenue for the firm will be 250 times 8, which will give us 2,000. So we see from this graph that it would be unhelpful for the firm to increase their price if you know that you are dealing with an elastic demand for your good or for your service. You gained this small area with an increase in price, but what you lost in terms of the increase in price, which is the decrease in quantity, outweighed that increase in price, which means that then the net effect is that the firm has rather worsened its total revenue stance. Now with this new price increment, the new total revenue is 400 short of the old one, which means that when the firm is having a product which has an elastic demand, it is not advisable to increase the price, because a price increase will lead to a reduction in total revenue. However, if the firm rather decreases its price, which means that now it is moving from 250 to 200. Then the firm will now move from total revenue of 200 to a total revenue of 2,400, which will mean that the firm has increased its revenue by 400. So for a firm who has an elastic demand for its good or its service, it will be better or it will be more profitable to reduce the price rather than to increase the price. Let's take a case where now the demand is no longer elastic, but it is inelastic. So still on the firm would want to increase its total revenue, and then it also knows that it is dealing with an inelastic demand curve. The question is, will it be advisable for the firm to increase its price or to decrease its price? And which one will earn the firm a higher profit margin or greater total revenue? So let's say the firm starts off at a price and quantity level. So you have price as 200 and quantity is 12. If the firm decides to increase the price to 250, we realize that quantity demanded falls from 12 to 10. And the idea behind the inelastic demand is that a unit increase in price will lead to a less than 1 unit decrease in quantity. So with this situation, then we say that the initial total revenue for the firm will be the 200 times 12, which is 2,400. Now price has increased, but quantity has decreased. But we know, based on our idea of inelastic demand, that the price increase will outweigh the quantity decrease, so that the net effect will be that total revenue will now be 250 times 10, which will be 2,500. We see that grammatically that the price increase, which is given by this region, will outweigh the quantity decrease, which will be given by this small proportion or this small area, so that the net effect will be that the firm will rather gain by increasing its price than by decreasing its price. With a price increase, our new total revenue is 2,500, which is 100 more than the previous total revenue of 2,400. So in this case, what if the firm decides instead to decrease the price? A price decrease will then lead to the firm losing 100, because it will start from 2,500 and end up at 2,400. So for an inelastic demand curve, the firm will benefit by rather increasing its price than decreasing its price. So this is the decision of the firm. If the product that the firm is selling is elastic, if the firm wants to earn more revenue, it has to decrease its price. If the product is inelastic, if the firm wants to increase its total revenue, it has to increase its price. So that's the decision rule for a firm who knows their elasticity of the good or the service they are offering to the consumers. However, if the product is unitary elastic, then a price increase or a price decrease will leave the total revenue to be the same. So that whether you increase price or you decrease the price, you would end up at the same revenue position. So let's have a situation where now the demand curve is elastic, price increases from 500 to 600, but quantity also decreases from 12 to 10, so that then your initial total revenue is equal to 500 times 12, which is 6,000. And then your new total revenue with the price increase is now 600 multiplied by 10, which is the same 6,000. So whether you increase the price or you decrease the price, because the elasticity is unitary, you would end up getting the same total revenue. So for the firm, increase price if you are dealing with inelastic goods, and then decrease your price if you are dealing with elastic goods. So that's how firms can use their knowledge of elasticity of their product to increase their total revenue. Firms can also use advertising to, in a way, change the sensitivity of the consumers. So assuming the consumers start off with an elastic demand for a good or a service, with intense advertisement, branding of the commodity, doing all the things that you need to do just to make people like a good, the firm can gradually change the nature of their elasticity to be inelastic, in the sense that consumers become attached to the good or to the service, so that price increments will not lead to more than proportionate changes in quantity demanded. So then the elasticity changes from an elastic case to an inelastic situation. And this is achievable if your advertisement is successful for the good or for the service. Let's look at the situation for the household or the farmer. So we say a household is basically agrarian. They produce foodstuffs and then they sell at the market. And we are saying also that farmers may be caught up in a dilemma as to whether to use improved seeds or to stick to the old ways of doing or sowing and harvesting. Let's assume we have a situation where a new breed of seed has been given to the farmer. Initially, the farmer can use his 1 acre of land to produce, say, 100 bags of rice. The new breed now affords the same farmer the opportunity to use the same 1 acre of land to produce now 110 bags of rice. Will it be more profitable for the farmer to use the old breed or the new breed? And will the farmer get more revenue by using the new breed rather than the old breed? Let's see how the analysis works out using our demand and supply curves. So we start off with our supply. Normally we know that agricultural products tend to have inelastic demand, so that you have our initial price and quantity. So we have, say, price to be and then quantity to be 100. With the use of the new breed, suppliers are able to supply more, which will shift the supply curve to the right, so that then you have a new supply curve shifting to the right. And this is because of the new breed used in the production. Shifting the supply curve to the right will then give us an increased quantity, which is our 110. But then the price level will fall, which means that then the producer is no longer getting 3 cedis for 1 bag, but he is now getting 2 cedis for 1 bag. Let's look at the total revenue stance of this household or this farmer. Initially he was getting 3. Total revenue initially will be 3 times the 100 bags, which will give the farmer 300. However, because of the new seed, now you are producing more, but because of the inelastic nature of the demand curve, the quantity only increases from 100 to 110, which means that then now your new total revenue will be 2 times 110, which means consumer is now getting a total revenue of 220. This 220 is 80 short of what he had if he had used the old seed to produce. So the consumer is caught up, the farmer is now caught up in this dilemma as to whether to use the new breed to produce or to use the old one. When he used the old breed, he had more revenue than if he used the new breed. And we know that this is because the elasticity of demand is inelastic. However, if the nature of the demand curve were to change, then the farmer would have gotten more revenue from using the new breed. So this is the dilemma. Should the farmer now reduce their supply just to get more revenue, or should the farmer increase their supply to get more revenue? Their decision will be based on the elasticity of demand for their products. So that's for the farmer or the household. Let's also look at how governments will apply this concept of elasticity in their decisions. Let's take the first, which is taxation. One way that governments earn more revenue is just by taxing the individuals or the citizens in the economy. And we know that the initial tax burden goes to the producers or the suppliers. And then government wouldn't also want to tax their citizens to the point where they will not be able to have some amount of bearable standard of living. So let's see what will happen with this idea of elasticity in the mind of the government. If the government knows that the elasticity of demand for a good that is going to be taxed is inelastic, what should it do? And if it knows also that the elasticity for that good is elastic, how should the tax be? Should the government tax more on the inelastic goods and less on the elastic good? Or should the government tax more on the elastic good and less on the inelastic good? So let's see the first situation where the good is inelastic. So we have an inelastic demand curve with an initial supply curve. We have this as our price level and then quantity. A tax will initially go to the suppliers, which will shift their supply curve to the left. This will decrease the quantity and then increase the price level. So this is the tax that government is imposing. How will this affect the consumer and how will this affect the producer? And is it advisable for the government to tax more in a situation where the demand curve is inelastic? We know by definition that when the demand curve is inelastic, consumers will not be so responsive to price increases or price decreases. So that in this case, consumers will not so much decrease their quantity that they consume for the good or the service. So government can tax this kind of product more because the reduction in quantity is low. How about the tax that is now imposed on the good or the service? How will the supplier deal with it? Normally, the supplier can either transfer all the tax to the consumer or share the tax with the consumer, or the supplier will bear all the tax depending on the nature of the demand curve. We'll look at the others, but let's see what will happen in this case where the demand curve is inelastic. So this is our tax. This is our tax. And this tax here, we are sharing it between the consumer and the producer. And because demand is inelastic, the producer is able to give way or to put a larger chunk of the tax on the consumer, because the producer knows that consumers are not so much responsive to changes in their price, so that they can afford to then give the consumer a higher proportion of the tax, and then the producer will take only this small portion. So what about if the demand or the good is now elastic in nature? Will it be more beneficial to the consumer if the government imposes a higher tax burden, or will it be better for the government to reduce the tax margin on the good or on the service? So let's see this case also when our demand is elastic and the supply. You have the old price and the old quantity. With this elastic demand, a government tax will now shift the supply curve to a new ST, where we'll have a new Q1, and then a new P1. Here we see that because the demand curve is relatively elastic, the producer is not able to shift a larger chunk of the tax on the consumer, because the producer knows that when they tax the consumer too much in terms of higher prices, they will reduce their quantity demanded by a larger margin. So what the producer will do is to bear a higher proportion of the tax, whilst the producer only passes a smaller proportion of the tax on the consumer. Because of the sensitivity of the good or the service also, it will not be so advisable for government to tax this kind of good or kind of service, because then its effect will be so heavy on the producers, because they will now have to bear a lot more of the tax. However, in the case of the inelastic, if these products are harmful goods or services, then government may use taxation as a policy to reduce its consumption. Okay. So here we see that governments should rather tax more goods that have inelastic demand than goods that have elastic demand. And producers are also able to shift more of the tax on the consumer if the good is the demand curve is inelastic, but they will bear a larger proportion of the tax if the elasticity of demand is elastic. So we have the same challenge of illicit drug use, but in this case, government is trying to rather use a demand side effect than the supply side effect to curtail the situation. So what government rather would do is, instead of increasing surveillance or supervision, they educate the populace. Let's see what will happen if this strategy is supposed to be used as a government policy. So now we have same demand supply curve, price and quantity. What the education will do is to serve as a disincentive for those who are in this use of illicit drugs to cease using it, so that then the demand curve will shift to the left, which means there would be a decrease in the demand for these drugs. A new equilibrium point for this case will then be P1 and Q1. This reduction will result in a reduction in the price. For those who are selling the good, they wouldn't want to sell this illicit drug for a lower price, so they would also reduce their quantity. In a way, this is a better way to handle the illicit drug situation than to use the supply side. So our idea of the elasticity of demand will also help government in its policy decision making. Using the education will in a way change the inelastic to elastic, because then people or the populace will be aware of the impact of drugs on their lives. But when you use the supply side, it would not have the effect, because the demand curve for these drugs will still be inelastic because of the addiction. So those are the different ways that we can apply elasticity in real life situations. Firms can use it to determine their total revenues. The farmer can also use it to see whether they can get more income or less income. And then government can use it in its taxation policies, and then its deterrence on the use of illicit